The polished floor turned to ice beneath my feet. As I lay there, unable to move, my mother didn't run to me. She hissed, "Get up! You're embarrassing us in front of the Vanderbilts." Then, my father ripped my grandfather's watch from my wrist and hurled it into the darkness. "Useless!" he roared. My heart shattered into a million pieces. But they didn't know. In that moment of absolute betrayal, they didn't just create a victim. They created an enemy. And I would use the very system they despised to bring their entire world crashing down. My name is Captain Zorla Heath, United States Army. I've been trained to assess a threat in seconds, to remain calm under fire, to compartmentalize pain. But none of my training at West Point prepared me for the moment the polished IPE wood floor of my family's Napa estate turned to ice beneath my feet. The Heath Vineyard was in its full glory, a postcard of Californian opulence. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the rolling hills, and the air, thick with the scent of money and blooming jasmine, carried the polite murmur of high society. Guests in linen suits and silk dresses held glasses of our award-winning Chardonnay, their laughter mingling with the clinking of silverware on porcelain. The aroma of roasted lamb chops, seasoned with rosemary from my mother's own garden, wafted from the sprawling flagstone patio. It was a scene of impeccable, calculated perfection, my family's specialty. I was moving through the crowd, a ghost in my own home, when it happened. One moment, I was walking toward the stone steps leading down to the main lawn. The next, my heel found no purchase. There was no stumble, no chance to regain my balance, just a sickening, frictionless slide. My cocktail glass flew from my hand, shattering against the stone with a sharp, crystalline pop that cut through the party's hum. Then came the impact. A brutal, blinding explosion of pain as my lower back slammed into the hard edge of a stone stair. The world went white, then tunneled into a pinpoint of agony. I lay there, sprawled on the gleaming floor, the breath knocked from my lungs. The pain was a living thing, a hot, searing fire centered at the base of my spine. But beneath the pain, a cold, horrifying clarity began to surface. My military-honed senses, trained to detect anomalies, were screaming. It wasn't just the unnatural slickness of the floor. It was the smell. A sweet, chemical scent, sharp and cloying, that clung to the air right where I had fallen. It was the smell of industrial-grade polish, freshly applied and dangerously thick, overpowering even the rich scent of the food. I tried to push myself up, to regain some semblance of dignity. My arms responded, but my legs, nothing. A terrifying numbness was creeping up from my waist, a cold tide extinguishing the fire of the initial impact. Panic, a feeling I hadn't truly known since basic training, began to claw at my throat. This wasn't an accident. My mother, Genevieve, stood at the top of the steps, a perfect statue in her cream-colored Chanel suit. She didn't run to me. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of social grace, showed no flicker of concern, only a profound, withering annoyance. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper, but a low, cutting hiss meant only for me. "Zorla, stop it. You're embarrassing the family in front of the Vanderbilts." She punctuated the sentence with a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the evening's most esteemed guests. To my mother, my potential paralysis was merely a social inconvenience. Lying there, a broken thing on my family's perfect floor, I felt a loneliness so profound it stole my breath. I have to ask, have you ever felt a betrayal so deep it physically hurt? If you have, let me know in the comments, because in that moment, I felt utterly alone. Then, my father, Alistair, strode forward. For a fleeting, foolish second, a child's hope flickered within me. He was coming to help. But his eyes, cold and hard as granite, weren't looking at my face. They were fixed on my wrist. He didn't bend to help me up. He bent to snatch the watch from my arm. It was my grandfather's Patek Philippe. A vintage piece, simple and elegant, with a worn leather strap. It was the only thing of value he had left me, the only person in this family who had ever truly loved me. On the back, his shaky script was engraved, "Time will prove your worth, Zorla." Alistair's fingers dug into my skin as he ripped the watch from my wrist. the old leather strap groaning in protest. He straightened up, held it for a moment between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of trash, and then, with a grunt of disgust, he hurled it into the deep green foliage of the azalea bushes nearby. "Useless thing!" he roared, his voice thick with contempt. And then he looked down at me, his daughter, lying helpless on the floor. Useless! The second word was for me. I knew it. Everyone knew it. Through the haze of pain and humiliation, my eyes found my sister, Serafina. She stood near the bar, a vision of grace in a flowing emerald silk dress. She wasn't looking at me with shock or pity. She was watching the scene with a small, quiet, triumphant smile playing on her perfectly painted lips. She leaned toward her best friend, murmuring just loud enough for the sound to carry over the sudden, stunned silence of the party. "I told you," she said, her voice a sweet poison. "She always has to make a scene to get attention." That was the final confirmation. The polished floor, the public humiliation, the desecration of my one sacred memory. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a perfectly orchestrated performance. And I was the star, broken and bleeding on their stage. The guests stood frozen, a gallery of horrified, fascinated statues. My family, my own blood, had cast me aside. In that deafening silence, only one person moved. Kyle Vance cut through the crowd. My West Point classmate, my friend. He didn't hesitate. He knelt beside me, his movements economical and precise, the way a soldier moves toward a fallen comrade. He said nothing to me, his focus absolute. He shrugged off his navy blazer and gently draped it over my legs, shielding me from the dozens of prying, curious eyes. It was a small gesture, but it was a fortress. Then, he looked up, not at me, but straight at my father. His jaw was set, and his eyes, usually warm, were now chips of steel. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a battlefield command. "Call 911, he said, the words clean and sharp as a bayonet. "Right now." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of a battle line being drawn. And as I lay there, looking from the dark green leaves that hid my grandfather's watch to the dark blue wool of the blazer that covered me, I knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of a war. The steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor is a lonely sound, an electronic metronome counting out the seconds of your uncertainty. In the sterile cold of the hospital room, waiting for the results of an MRI that would define my future, I closed my eyes against the fluorescent glare. The sharp, antiseptic smell of the room faded, replaced by something else. The familiar scent of damp earth, PVC pipes, and Elmer's glue. I wasn't a 32-year-old captain with a potential spinal injury anymore. I was back in the cluttered, wonderful world of 8th grade science. The all-school science fair was the most important event of my middle school existence. For 3 months, it was my entire world. While other kids were at football practice, I poured every ounce of my focus into my project, a complex, multi-stage water filtration system. It was my baby. I spent hours after school in the science lab, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows. I meticulously cut pipes, layered sand and charcoal in their clear chambers, and ran dozens of tests, dutifully recording the changing pH levels in my notebook. I dreamed of that first-place blue ribbon, of the impressed nod from Mr. Davison, the science teacher I idolized. But more than that, I dreamed of a different kind of approval. A simple, unqualified nod from my father. I was so close. The night before the fair, I went to the lab for one final check. The school was quiet, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The moment I pushed open the heavy door to the lab, I knew something was profoundly wrong. A puddle of murky brown water was spreading across the checkered linoleum floor. My heart plummeted, a stone dropping into a bottomless well. My project, my beautiful system of pipes and filters, was in pieces. It was a carnage. It looked as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. The main basin was cracked, the carefully layered filters dumped out and mixed into a muddy slurry, and the clear pipes were shattered. And standing there, in the middle of the wreckage, was my sister. Serafina. She held a small tack hammer in her hand, its polished head catching the light. Her expression was a masterpiece of wide-eyed, perfect innocence. She looked from the devastation to me, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise, as if she had just stumbled upon the scene herself. The chaos that followed was a blur of hurried footsteps and sharp, adult voices. Mr. Davison arrived, his face a mask of disappointment. Then, my parents, summoned from a dinner party. My mother's first words were not, "Zorla, are you okay?" but a sharp intake of breath and a muttered, "What a mess." That's when Serafina's performance began. It was worthy of an Oscar. Tears, big and dramatic, streamed down her face. She sobbed that she had only been trying to help. She claimed she saw a small leak and had tried to gently tap a loose fitting back into place. But I, her story went, had stormed in, screaming at her like a lunatic. In her version of the story, I was the villain. Overwhelmed by the pressure of the competition, I had flown into a hysterical rage and destroyed my own project. "She gets so intense," Sarah whispered to my mother, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. I was just trying to make it perfect for her. I stood there, stunned into a ringing silence. I tried to explain. I pointed to the hammer in her hand, to the sheer, deliberate violence of the destruction. This wasn't a gentle tap gone wrong. This was annihilation. But my words were just noise, the frantic buzzing of a fly caught in a spider's web. No one listened. No one believed me. My father, Alistair, looked at me, not with anger, but with a weary, soul-crushing disappointment that was infinitely worse. "It's always you, Zorla," he said, his voice flat. "Always causing trouble." My mother was already talking to the janitor, more concerned with cleaning up the unpleasant scene than with discovering the truth. The verdict was swift and brutal. I was disqualified from the science fair. My 3 months of tireless work were unceremoniously swept into a large, black garbage can. My punishment was a month of being grounded and the ultimate, soul-searing humiliation. I had to write a formal letter of apology to Serafina for raising my voice and falsely accusing her. The first-place prize that year went to a volcano made of papier-mâché, baking soda, and vinegar. That night, I hid in my room, the door locked, my face buried in my pillow. I could hear my parents' voices drifting up from the living room below, their tones warm with admiration. They were praising Serafina for her bravery and for being such a caring, considerate older sister, for enduring my supposed outburst with such grace. It was the first time I truly understood a fundamental law of the Heath household. The truth didn't matter. A good performance was worth more. The story was always more important than the facts, and Serafina was always, without fail, a better storyteller. It makes me wonder, have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do, just because someone else's story was more believable? If this has happened to you, share it in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one. The insistent, metronomic beeping of the monitor pulled me back to the present, back to the cold sheets and the terrifying uncertainty. I opened my eyes, the white acoustic tiles of the hospital room ceiling coming into sharp, unforgiving focus. The cold numbness in my legs was still there, a terrifying echo of the cold numbness that had settled in my heart all those years ago. I finally saw it with perfect, painful clarity. The fall on the IPE wood floor wasn't a new tragedy. It was just a bigger, more brutal, adult-sized version of the smashed science project. The players were the same. Serafina, the angelic saboteur with a cunning, hidden smile. My parents, with their calculated indifference and blatant, unwavering favoritism. And me, the designated victim, blamed for my own suffering. Everything was precisely the same. Except for one critical thing. The 8th-grade girl in the science lab had locked herself in her room and cried until her eyes were swollen shut. The 32-year-old woman lying in this hospital bed would not. I would not cry. I would fight. The decision to fight, born in the cold silence of a hospital room, had actually taken root years earlier, after my first year as a cadet at West Point. That summer, instead of returning to the suffocating luxury of the Heath estate, I executed my first real strategic maneuver. I told my family I'd been selected for a special summer training program, an intensive course that was classified. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. My real destination was far from any military base. I bought a one-way ticket on a Greyhound bus heading west, to Midland, Texas. The long, rumbling journey was a kind of decompression. With every mile that separated me from the lush, manicured vineyards of Napa, I felt a layer of expectation and disappointment peel away. I wanted to know what it felt like to earn my own keep, to stand on my own 2 feet, completely outside the long, cold shadow of the Heath name. I arrived in Midland under the blistering West Texas sun with one duffel bag and a few $100s saved from my cadet stipend. My new home was a cramped studio apartment above a tire shop on the edge of town. The air perpetually smelled of vulcanized rubber, and the oppressive summer heat was a physical presence, pressing in from all sides. There was no air conditioning, only a rickety ceiling fan that stirred the hot air around. I found a job doing bookkeeping and inventory for a small independent oil drilling company. The office was a dusty trailer, and my coworkers were rough-edged men with sun-creased faces and calloused hands who spoke in straight, unvarnished sentences. Life in Midland was a stark, brutal contrast to Napa. The world was not green and soft, but brown and sharp. The air was not filled with the scent of Chardonnay and roses, but with dust and diesel fumes. I worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. My hands, once accustomed to the polished wood of a rifle stock, were now smudged with grease and covered in a fine layer of red dust. My neat, military-style bun would be limp with sweat by noon. Dinner was often a turkey sandwich and a bag of chips from a 7-Eleven, eaten alone on the lumpy mattress that served as my bed and couch. There were nights, sitting in that sweltering little room, listening to the drone of cicadas and the distant roar of trucks on the highway, that I felt a profound, aching loneliness. The exhaustion was bone deep. I would stare at the water-stained ceiling and wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. The easy comfort of home, the cool swimming pool, the gourmet meals, they all felt a million miles away. I was adrift. But then, Friday would come. My boss, a stout man named Earl, would hand me a check. It wasn't much, but as I held that small rectangle of paper in my hand, a powerful, fierce pride would swell in my chest, chasing away the fatigue and doubt. This was my money, earned with my own mind and my own 2 hands. It was the most valuable thing I'd ever owned. It was proof. I was not useless. I was a person who could survive. With my first few paychecks, I bought a beat-up 20-year-old Ford pickup truck. It was rusted in places and the engine made a whirring, rattling sound, but it was mine. It was freedom. One scorching evening, on my way back from work, that freedom sputtered to a halt. The engine died without warning on a lonely stretch of road miles from town. I popped the hood, staring blankly at the greasy, complicated mess of wires and metal, my heart sinking with despair. Just as a wave of hopelessness was about to wash over me, a dusty, grease-stained tow truck pulled up. An older mechanic with a kind, weathered face and a name, Gus, stitched on his shirt, got out. He didn't say much, just grunted, peered under the hood, and went to work. Within 20 minutes, he had diagnosed a faulty alternator and, through some mechanical wizardry, managed to get the engine running again. I fumbled in my purse, ready to give him every dollar I had. "How much do I owe you?" Gus wiped his hands on an old, oily rag and shook his head. "Nah, forget it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He looked at me, at my dusty clothes and tired eyes. "You remind me of my own daughter. Stubborn as a mule, that one." He gave a small, genuine smile. "Let's just call it a welcome to Texas dinner on me." I stood there, speechless. This simple, uncalculated act of kindness from a complete stranger broke something open inside me. I felt a stinging in my eyes, and to my own surprise, I started to cry. Not the quiet, suppressed tears of my childhood, but big, messy, grateful tears. I hadn't cried in months, maybe years. It was a release, a cleansing of all the loneliness and struggle. That summer ended. I drove my rattling pickup back to the Greyhound station and returned to West Point. I was tanner, my hands were rough with calluses, but I walked with a new kind of confidence. I had survived, no, I had thrived in a world that had nothing to do with my family's name or money. I had proven to myself, the only person who mattered, that I was not the useless thing my father saw. I was capable, I was resilient. That summer in Midland became my mental fortress, an internal wellspring of strength. It was the first brick I laid in the foundation of a life I would build for myself, a life whose value could never be snatched away and thrown into the bushes. It was the beginning of my true independence. The inner fortress I built that summer in Texas was tested many times over the years, but never more so than during a brutal winter field exercise at Fort Drum, New York. It was years after my Texas escape, and by then, I was a seasoned captain. But the cold at Fort Drum is a different kind of enemy. It's a relentless, creeping force that seeps into your bones and tests the very limits of your endurance. The snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, muffling the world in a blanket of white. The temperature had plunged far below freezing, and the wind howled through the pines like a hungry wolf. We were days into a complex logistics simulation, and I had made a mistake. A small miscalculation in our supply chain, but one that had a cascading effect, causing delays and forcing other units to scramble. It was fixable, but in the unforgiving hierarchy of the Army, there's no room for error. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, heavy and cold as the snow itself. I was sitting alone in the dim, cramped command tent, the canvas walls groaning under the assault of the wind. The only light came from the green glow of a tactical computer screen. I was exhausted, chilled to the core, and nursing a profound sense of failure. My dinner consisted of a rock-hard energy bar from an MRE, which I chewed on without tasting. In the isolation and the biting cold, the old familiar voice of my father echoed in my mind. Useless, always causing trouble. The feeling of being the family's failed investment was a ghost that never strayed far. The tent flap rustled, and a blast of frigid air swirled in, followed by Cale Vance. He was covered in a light dusting of snow, his cheeks red from the cold. In his gloved hands, he held two battered, steaming thermal mugs. He didn't say much, just nudged one of the mugs across the small folding table toward me. A cloud of fragrant steam rose from it, smelling impossibly, wonderfully of home. Heated it up on the field stove, he said, his voice low. He sat down opposite me, wrapping his own hands around his mug. You looked like you were about to freeze solid. I looked down into the mug. It was Campbell's chicken noodle soup, the classic red and white can, a staple of every American childhood. A simple, almost laughably mundane thing in the face of our high-stakes military exercise. But in that moment, the warmth seeping through the metal into my frozen fingers felt more luxurious than any five-star meal at my family's estate. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scrape of our spoons against the mugs and the relentless howl of the wind outside. It was a comfortable silence, the kind you can only share with someone you trust completely. It was Cale who broke it, but not with questions or advice. He just nodded toward my untouched energy bar. That stuff'll kill you faster than the enemy will. I managed a small, weak smile, and then, I don't know why, but the dam inside me broke. Under the weak, flickering beam of a single battery-powered lantern, I started to talk. For the first time in my life, I told someone the full story of the 8th grade science fair. I described the project in detail, the pride I had felt, the sight of its destruction, the cold look in my father's eyes, and the crushing weight of the punishment. I told him about the letter of apology I was forced to write to my own saboteur. I wasn't complaining or looking for pity. It felt more like a field report, a dispassionate detailing of past trauma, as if I were finally declassifying a painful, long-held secret. I laid out the facts, the evidence of an injustice that had shaped the very core of who I was. Cale listened. He just listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He gave me the rare, precious gift of his undivided attention, his gaze steady and focused in the dim light. When I finally finished, my voice trailing off into the quiet of the tent, a heavy silence settled between us. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I braced myself for the usual response, an awkward pat on the shoulder, a quick change of subject. But Kale just looked me straight in the eye. "They were wrong, Zorla," he said, his voice quiet but firm as bedrock. "They were profoundly, horribly wrong." He took a sip of his soup, then added, "You are one of the most capable, resilient officers I have ever served with." His words landed like a cool drink of water on parched earth. It wasn't empty praise, it was a professional assessment from a peer. A brother in arms who had seen me under pressure, who had witnessed my competence and my grit firsthand on the training fields and in command meetings. It was validation. Pure, simple, and priceless. For the first time, I felt like my worth wasn't something I had to constantly prove, but something that was simply seen and acknowledged. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the warmth of the soup still lingering in my belly. The wind still raged outside, and the cold was just as bitter, but it couldn't touch me. For the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, a deep and dreamless sleep. I had found my family. It wasn't in a magnificent vineyard in Napa Valley, surrounded by wealth and status. It was here, in a canvas tent in the middle of a frozen wilderness, forged in the quiet loyalty and shared understanding between soldiers. It was a family of choice, and it was stronger than blood. The peace I had found at Fort Drum, that quiet sense of belonging, lasted for a few precious months. I carried it with me like a warm ember. But my family had a way of finding me, of sending a cold draft to extinguish any flame of contentment I managed to build. The assault, when it came, wasn't a frontal attack. It was a stealth infiltration, disguised as an olive branch. It came in the form of a phone call. It was a few months before the fateful party. I was in my sparse but orderly apartment near the base, reviewing personnel files, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Napa area code. It was my mother. Her voice, when I answered, was unnaturally sweet, a syrupy tone she usually reserved for wealthy potential clients or influential neighbors. "Zorla, darling, how are you?" she began, the words flowing like warm honey. "We were just talking about you last night. Serafina was saying how much she misses her little sister. We all do. The estate just feels so empty without you here." I stood by the window, my guard instantly up. This was a tactic I knew well. The love bombing. The sudden, overwhelming affection that always preceded a request. But despite my cynicism, honed by years of experience, a foolish, treacherous part of my heart flickered. A tiny, desperate spark of hope. I hadn't spoken to them in almost a year. Maybe they had changed. Maybe they really did miss me. Maybe this time would be different. "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Work is busy." "Oh, I'm sure it is, dear. We're so proud of you, you know," she continued, laying it on thick. "Your father and I were just saying, our daughter, the captain, it has such a ring to it." I remained silent, letting her play her hand. After a few more minutes of saccharine praise and feigned interest in my life, she finally pivoted to the true purpose of the call. The pivot was so smooth, so practiced, it was almost elegant. "Speaking of work," she said, her voice dropping into a more confidential tone, "things here have hit a little temporary rough patch. You know how it is. But it's actually an opportunity. Your father has a brilliant plan to expand into a new line of premium reserve wines." Here it comes, I thought. "The thing is, darling, the banks are being so difficult these days. We need a rather large loan to get it off the ground, and they're insisting on a guarantor with an impeccable reputation." She paused for effect. "And then we thought of you. With your rank, your spotless record from West Point. My love, you would be the perfect guarantor. It's just a formality, of course, a simple signature." A chill, colder than any Fort Drum wind, snaked its way down my spine. It wasn't just about money. It was about my name, my career. The one thing I had built for myself, brick by painful brick, entirely on my own. They wanted to leverage it, to use my hard-won honor as collateral for one of their risky ventures. The request was so audacious, so profoundly disrespectful, that it left me momentarily speechless. My hesitation was all the opening my father needed. I heard a rustle on the other end, and then Alistair's voice was on the line, sharp and stripped of all pretense. "Listen, Zorla," he said, his tone the one he used for underperforming employees. It was clipped, impatient, and utterly dismissive. "Your mother is being too delicate. Let's be frank. This family has invested a great deal in you, your education, your upbringing. It's time you showed some responsibility. Stop being selfish. This is your duty." Duty. That one word hit me like a physical blow. It was the same word they used when they needed me to cancel my plans to babysit for Sarah. The same word they used when they expected me to take the blame for Sarah's mistakes. It was the word they used to chain me to their expectations, to remind me that my life was not my own, but a debt I owed to them. All the old wounds, all the slights and sacrifices came rushing back. The smashed science project, the constant casual cruelty, the feeling of being perpetually second best. In that moment, the tiny spark of hope inside me was not just extinguished, it was annihilated. There was nothing left but cold, hard ash. I took a slow, deep breath, the way I would before giving a difficult order. When I spoke, my voice was calm, level, and as cold as the ice that had just formed around my heart. No. A stunned silence crackled on the other end of the line. I had never said a flat no to them before. I had demurred, I had equivocated, I had made excuses, but I had never simply refused. "What did you say?" Alistair's voice was a low growl of disbelief. "I said no," I repeated, each word a carefully placed stone, building a wall between us. "I will not do it. My honor is not for sale." There was another beat of shocked silence, followed by an incoherent roar of fury from my father. Then, the line went dead. He had hung up on me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The quiet of my small apartment felt vast and absolute. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my refusal was not the end of the matter. It was a declaration of war. They would not let this go. They would retaliate. And that sudden, effusive invitation to a party in my honor that arrived a few weeks later? I knew exactly what it was. It wasn't an olive branch. It was the chosen battlefield. The doctor delivered the diagnosis with a practiced, gentle detachment that felt more chilling than any overt display of pity. Incomplete spinal cord injury. The words hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, clinical and cold, devoid of emotion. He spoke of prognoses, of the long road of physical therapy, of possibilities and limitations. He used phrases like, "significant recovery is possible," and "outcomes can vary." But I wasn't listening to the nuances. I was staring at the familiar grid of acoustic tiles on the ceiling, the same pattern I'd stared at when I first woke up here. But something fundamental inside me had shifted. I didn't cry. The time for tears, for the soft release of grief, was over. That was a luxury for a different life, a different person. The years of suppressed anger, the lifetime of swallowing injustices big and small, did not erupt in a fiery, cathartic rage. Instead, it underwent a chemical change. It cooled, it compressed, it hardened. It crystallized into a single, perfect, ice-cold objective. The pain was a roaring fire at the base of my spine. The fear was a humming electric current beneath my skin. But overriding it all was a clarity so sharp it was almost peaceful. This was no longer just about me. I turned my head on the stiff hospital pillow and looked at Cale. He had been there all night, a silent, steady presence in the uncomfortable visitor's chair by my bed. He hadn't slept. I could see the fatigue in the set of his jaw. But his eyes were alert and focused entirely on me. He was waiting. Not for me to break down, but for my orders. He knew me that well. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, but it was stripped of any tremor of the victim. It was the voice of a commander assessing a hostile action, identifying the enemy, and choosing the field of battle. "They did this deliberately, Cale," I said, my words precise and evenly spaced, each one a carefully laid stone. "This was not a family dispute. They assaulted an officer of the United States Army. I emphasized every single word. Officer, United States Army. It wasn't just a title, it was a shield, a sword, a jurisdiction. I was reframing the narrative, not as a broken daughter betrayed by her family, but as a soldier attacked on home soil. I was taking my personal agony and placing it under the authority of the one institution I trusted, the one family that had never failed me. I was invoking the oath I had taken, the one we had both sworn with our hands raised to defend our nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I was realizing, with a chilling and absolute certainty, that sometimes the most dangerous domestic enemies share your bloodline and sleep under the same roof. Cale's face hardened, the fatigue in his eyes replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He understood the strategic pivot immediately. He knew the profound implications of my words. This was no longer a private matter to be handled by the overwhelmed local police and expensive civil lawyers who could be bought and sold. This was an attack on a federal officer, a direct threat to military readiness and personnel integrity. I understand, he said. His voice dropped into the formal, clipped tone of a subordinate acknowledging a critical command. He stood up, the chair scraping softly against the polished linoleum. He pulled out his phone, gave me one last, firm nod of confirmation, and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door almost closed behind him, affording me the illusion of privacy. I could hear his voice, muffled but clear, through the slight gap. It was not the voice of my concerned friend anymore. It was the voice of Captain Kalen Vance, United States Army, reporting up the chain of command. "Sir, this is Captain Kalen Vance, service number." I heard him recite his credentials with the practiced, automatic ease of a soldier. "I am reporting a Category 1 incident. One of our officers, Captain Zorla Heath, has been intentionally assaulted. The potential for permanent, debilitating injury is high." There was a pause as he listened. "The incident occurred on U.S. soil." "Yes, sir." "The assailants were her own family." That single phone call was a pebble that started an avalanche. It activated a machine my family, in all their arrogant civilian wealth and social power, could never have comprehended. They understood the power of money, of lawyers on retainer, of backroom deals and social influence. They had no concept of the vast, impersonal, and relentless institutional power they had just provoked. Within hours, things began to move with a quiet, terrifying military efficiency. A representative from the nearest Judge Advocate General's Corps office, a woman with the sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor of a career officer, arrived at the hospital before the sun had set. The Napa Police Department, which had been treating the case as a messy, domestic incident, now found themselves cooperating with stone-faced criminal investigators from the Army CID. The official report was no longer a simple assault. It was now classified as an act causing potential harm to an active duty military asset. An act that directly impacted national security and combat readiness. I felt the shift in the atmosphere, a tangible change in the gravity of the room. The immense weight I had been carrying, the crushing burden of fighting this alone, began to lift. It was being transferred to broader, stronger shoulders. The system, the one I had dedicated my life to, was now at my back. Later that afternoon, the JAG lawyer entered my room. Her Class A uniform was immaculate, her name tag reading, Reyes. Her rank insignia showed she was a major. She moved with an air of cool, unshakable competence that I, as a fellow officer, found immensely comforting. She didn't offer empty condolences or fuss over my condition. She got straight to the point. "Captain Heath," she began, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Major Reyes. I've been assigned as lead counsel for your case. I've reviewed Captain Vance's preliminary report and the initial findings from the local authorities." She pulled a secured tablet from her briefcase and sat down. All business. "From this moment on, the JAG Corps will be handling all legal and investigative aspects of this incident. Your only mission now, Captain, is to focus on your recovery. We will handle the rest." She looked at me then, her professional expression softening for just a fraction of a second, an undercurrent of profound solidarity passing between us. "We take care of our own, Captain." Lying in that hospital bed, I finally allowed myself to close my eyes without the weight of the world pressing down on my eyelids. The war had been declared, and the battle plans were being drawn. But for the first time in my life, I was not the sole combatant on the field. I had the full force and might of the United States Army on my side. The Heath family had picked a fight with their daughter. They had no idea they had just gone to war with an army. While I was learning to navigate the world from a hospital bed, the wheels of military justice were turning with relentless, quiet force. My days were a monotonous cycle of physical therapy, pain management, and staring at the ceiling. But my mind was on the front lines, receiving dispatches from Major Reyes. She was my forward observer, my eyes and ears on the ground. One morning, Kyle brought me a book by the researcher Brené Brown. I opened it to a random page and my eyes landed on a sentence. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. It felt like a direct order. At that exact moment, my phone rang. It was Major Reyes. "The operation is a go, Captain," she said, her voice all business. "Warrant's been served." I later learned how it unfolded. It was a perfect sun-drenched Napa Valley morning. My father and mother were having breakfast on the veranda. Croissants and fresh orange juice, a scene of domestic tranquility. That tranquility was shattered by the arrival of a convoy of unmarked sedans crunching up their perfectly manicured gravel driveway. The Heath estate, a place so private it was practically a fortress, was suddenly breached. Agents from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI, a joint task force assembled due to the element of financial fraud, fanned out across the property. They were polite, professional, and completely immovable. They secured the perimeter, their very presence a violation of the bubble of power and control my family had always taken for granted. While one team collected forensic samples from the IPE wood floor, the primary target was Alistair's private office. My parents, I was told, were stunned into a state of indignant disbelief. My mother protested about their reputation, while my father blustered about his high-priced lawyers. But their threats and social standing meant nothing to these men and women. For the first time in their lives, the Heaths were utterly powerless as strangers, armed with the full authority of the U.S. government, began to methodically dismantle their private world. In my father's opulent, mahogany-paneled office, behind a priceless landscape painting, they found it. A state-of-the-art biometric safe, set flush into the wall. When asked for the combination, Alistair refused, his face a mask of cold fury. Major Reyes's voice crackled over the phone as she gave me the play-by-play. "The FBI's tech team is working on it, but it's a complex system. They're projecting a few hours." "There might be a shortcut," I said, a sudden intuitive thought striking me. "Cale is here. Can you put him on?" I explained my hunch to Cale. It was a long shot, a psychological guess based on a lifetime of observing my father's obsessions. Cale made a quick call to a friend of his in Army Cyber Command. It was unorthodox, but these were unusual circumstances. He relayed my theory. A few minutes later, he got a text back. Major Reyes came back on the line. "Captain, your hunch was remarkably accurate. We just received a tip." Her voice held a note of professional respect. The combination to the safe was Serafina's birthday. 8 digits, entered backward. A small chilling detail that laid bare the twisted landscape of my father's mind. His golden child, his prized possession, her identity the key to protecting his darkest secrets. The heavy door of the safe swung open. At first, what they found was exactly what the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit expected. 2 sets of books, one for the IRS and one for reality, detailing a web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. It was enough to cause my father serious trouble, but buried beneath the ledgers in a sealed manila envelope, they found something far more sinister. They found the weapon. It wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a document. A meticulously drafted, multi-page plan, handwritten in my father's own precise, sloping script. It was a blueprint for my destruction. Major Reyes read excerpts to me over the phone, her voice cold and steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of shock. The plan outlined, step by step, a strategy to orchestrate a regrettable accident for me. It detailed how, following the accident, they would invoke a medical power of attorney, a document I vaguely remembered them tricking me into signing years ago, just in case something happens to you on duty, darling, to have me declared legally incompetent. The final step was to seize control of my assets, including a substantial trust my grandfather had left solely in my name, a trust my father had always resented. The premeditation was horrifying. There were notes in the margins comparing the efficacy and detectability of different chemical agents to be used on the floor. Isopropyl alcohol mixed with carnauba wax, one note read, maximum slip, minimal trace. There were calculations about the force needed to ensure a fall severe enough to cause a spinal injury, but not immediately fatal. This wasn't a spontaneous act of cruelty born from a moment of anger. This was a cold, calculated, corporate-style plot to eliminate a failed investment and absorb her assets. It was conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, wire fraud, and a dozen other felonies. The discovery of that document changed everything. It transformed the case from a brutal assault into a deeply premeditated criminal conspiracy. It was the smoking gun, the Rosetta Stone of my family's treachery. There was a long silence on the phone after Major Reyes finished reading. I could hear her take a deep, steadying breath on the other end. The truth was out, uglier and more monstrous than I could have ever imagined. But as Brené Brown wrote, it was not a weakness. It was a weapon. My weapon. Captain, Major Reyes said finally, her voice ringing with the certainty of a verdict already delivered. We have everything. Your battle is won. All that's left is the sentencing. The meeting was not a negotiation. It was a tactical surrender, and they just didn't know it yet. The chosen venue was not their lawyer's plush, mahogany-paneled office in San Francisco, with its panoramic city views designed to intimidate. Instead, the battlefield was a sterile, windowless conference room in a federal building, a place devoid of personality and power plays. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and bureaucratic indifference. They were already there when we arrived. My father, Alistair, my mother, Genevieve, and my sister, Serafina, sat on one side of a long, polished table. They were flanked by their team of high-priced lawyers, looking confident, almost smug, as if this were merely a civil proceeding to be resolved with a checkbook. They saw me, and their expressions tightened with a flicker of annoyance, not fear. On the other side of the table sat my team. Major Reyes, sharp and composed, a grim-faced assistant U.S. attorney named Mr. Chen, and Kale, standing guard behind me. I was in my wheelchair, dressed in my formal Army service uniform, the dark blue jacket adorned with my rank and ribbons. I felt the weight of the uniform, not as a burden, but as armor. Today I was not their victim. I was Captain Zorla Heath, representing the institution they had grievously underestimated. Their lead counsel, a man with silver hair and a $5,000 suit, began with an air of magnanimous condescension. We are, of course, deeply saddened by the unfortunate accident that befell Zorla, he said smoothly. And in the spirit of family reconciliation, the Heath family is prepared to make a very generous settlement offer to cover all medical expenses and ensure Zorla's future comfort. Mr. Chen, the federal prosecutor, let a small, cold smile touch his lips. He didn't respond to the offer. Instead, he slid a thin file across the table. Let's skip the part about the accident, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unnerving authority. And let's talk about the lab report from the FBI's forensic team, the one detailing the high concentration of 99% isopropyl alcohol mixed with carnauba wax found on the specific section of the IPE floor where my client fell. Alistair's confident posture faltered. Just a fraction, but I saw it. The first crack in the facade. Major Reyes took her cue. And while we're on the subject, she said, tapping her tablet, let's review a few other items. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. The first image was a close-up photograph of the dangerously slick floorboards. The next slide contained sworn statements from party guests, describing my mother's cold reaction and my father's rage. Then, a timeline appeared, showing the 15-minute delay between my fall and the 911 call. cross-referenced with the audio recording of Kale's frantic and then furious demands. Serafina began to tremble, her perfectly manicured hands clutching each other in her lap. My mother stared at the screen, her face paling beneath its expensive foundation. But that was just the opening salvo. The kill shot was yet to come. Mr. Chen stood up and walked slowly toward the screen. "And now, for the centerpiece of our evidence," he said. "Exhibit A." He clicked the remote. The image on the screen changed to a high-resolution scan of a handwritten document. It was the plan from my father's safe. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Mr. Heath," Mr. Chen said, his voice deceptively calm. He used a laser pointer to highlight a specific, damning phrase. "Is this your handwriting? The note here in the margin? The one that reads, 'Ensure the fall is severe enough to cause spinal trauma'?" The collapse was instantaneous and absolute. It was like watching a building being imploded. Genevieve let out a small, strangled gasp, her eyes wide with genuine, horrified shock. She turned to her husband, not as a co-conspirator, but as if seeing a monster for the first time. Alistair's face had gone from pale to a waxy, grayish-white. Beads of sweat popped out on his forehead, and he seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. And Serafina. She completely unraveled. She broke into loud, ugly, gulping sobs. "I didn't know," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at her father. "I didn't know about that. I just thought to teach her a lesson, to put her in her place." Her confession blurted out in a torrent of panicked self-preservation hung in the air, a final pathetic admission of her own petty cruelty. The united front of the Heath family had shattered into a million pieces, each one scrambling to save themselves, to point the finger at someone else. Their downfall was not majestic or tragic. It was squalid, pathetic, and total. For the first time, I let myself look at them. I met my father's terrified, empty eyes. I met my mother's look of dawning horror. I met my sister's tear-streaked, self-pitying gaze. I had spent a lifetime craving their approval, fearing their disapproval. Now I felt nothing. Just a vast, quiet emptiness where the pain used to be. I had seen enough. I turned my head slightly and looked at Major Reyes. "I believe I've said all I need to say," I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the sound of Sarah's weeping. It was a dismissal. Major Reyes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Kyle moved behind me, his hands resting gently on the handles of my wheelchair. He turned me around and pushed me toward the door, leaving the wreckage of my former family behind us. We left them to be devoured by the consequences of their own monstrous actions, their panicked whispers and accusations fading as the heavy door clicked shut behind us. The war was over. I had won. The news came in pieces, delivered by Major Reyes in her typically clipped, professional manner. Alistair Heath and Serafina Heath were sentenced to long prison terms for a litany of federal crimes. The Heath estate, the vineyards, the wine brand. Everything was seized and liquidated to pay off fines and restitution. Genevieve, left with nothing, was forced to move into a small, rented apartment in a town she once would have sneered at. The Heath dynasty had turned to ash. I'd imagined this moment for months. I thought victory would taste sweet, like justice. I thought it would feel like a weight being lifted, a triumphant crescendo. It didn't. Instead, the aftermath of the war left a hollow, echoing silence in its wake. There was no joy, no elation, just a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. I had won. But in the process, I had systematically annihilated my own family. And even a toxic family, I was discovering, leaves a gaping hole when it's gone. My days fell into a new, grueling rhythm at a military rehabilitation center in San Antonio. Each morning was a battle fought on a new front. It was a war against my own body, a fight to coax life back into nerves and muscles that had been silenced. Learning to take a single, wobbly step with the help of parallel bars felt like a greater struggle than any obstacle course at West Point. But alongside the physical battle, I was fighting the ghosts in my mind. The faces of my family in that conference room, their masks of power ripped away to reveal the pathetic, panicked souls beneath. The fight was over, but the battlefield was still littered with wreckage. One afternoon, Cale came to visit, his expression unusually troubled. "Your mother found my number," he said, his voice hesitant. "She called." He told me she had been weeping, begging him to pass on a message. She pleaded for my forgiveness. She swore she had no idea what Alistair was planning, that she was as shocked as anyone. She loved me, she claimed. She had always loved me. I listened to Cale recount the conversation, my own expression unmoving. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even a flicker of the old familiar hope. I had learned long ago that my mother's not knowing was a carefully cultivated survival skill. It was a willful blindness, a conscious choice to look away from any unpleasantness that might tarnish the perfect facade of her life. Her ignorance was not a defense. It was her complicity. "You don't have to reply," Cale said softly, seeing the blankness in my eyes. "I know," I said. And that was all. The conversation was over. The door was closed. A few weeks later, on a rare weekend pass from the center, I asked Kyle to do something for me. We drove for hours, heading west out of the city toward the coast. We ended up at Point Reyes, a wild, windswept stretch of the Northern California coastline. The air was cool and sharp with the scent of salt and cypress. Cale pushed my wheelchair along a rugged path until we reached a bluff overlooking the vast, churning expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The ocean was a tumultuous gray-green, its surface flecked with whitecaps. The waves crashed against the rocks below with a relentless, percussive roar. It was a scene of raw, untamed power, a perfect antidote to the sterile, controlled environment of the hospital. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was the key to the front door of the Heath estate. For years, I had kept it on my keychain, through every move, every deployment. I had told myself it was just a spare, but I knew the truth. It was a symbol of a faint, deeply buried hope that one day there would be a home for me to return to. That one day the door would open and I would be welcomed. I held the key in my palm, its metal cool against my skin. I looked at it, this small, obsolete piece of metal that represented so much pain and so much false hope. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, I drew my arm back and threw it as far as I could out over the cliff. It caught the light for a brief second, a tiny golden arc against the gray sky, before disappearing without a splash into the turbulent water below. "It's over," I whispered, more to myself than to Cale. He came to stand beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped my eye and traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of anger. It was a tear of release. I nodded. "I'm okay," I said, my voice clear and steady above the roar of the surf. "I just realized something. I was raised on the Bible verse about forgiving 70 times 7. I always thought it was about them, about letting them off the hook." I looked out at the endless ocean, a symbol of a future that was both terrifyingly empty and wonderfully full of possibility. But I was wrong. The greatest forgiveness isn't for them, it's for me. Forgiving myself for being weak enough to keep hoping. Forgiving myself for wanting love from people who were incapable of giving it. I forgive them so they no longer have any power over me. But mostly, I forgive myself. I took a deep breath of the salty air, and for the first time since I stepped onto that polished ipe floor, I felt free. 2 years passed. 2 years of relearning the world, one painful, determined step at a time. The road back was not a straight line, but a winding path of victories and setbacks. But I walked it. And it led me home. Not to the sprawling, sun-scorched vineyards of Napa, but to the gray stone walls and hallowed grounds of West Point. The Army, in its own way, took care of me. After my medical retirement from active duty, they offered me a teaching position. Now, my title is Professor Heath, and I teach a course on military ethics and leadership to the next generation of officers. I live in a small historic house on the academy grounds with Cale, who, in a stroke of perfect serendipity, was also reassigned here as an instructor. Every morning, I wake up to the sight of the majestic Hudson River, its surface calm and gray in the early light. I feel a sense of peace I have never known, a quiet that isn't empty, but full. On the second anniversary of the day I walked out of the rehabilitation center, Cale handed me a small, velvet-lined box. His expression was a mixture of nervousness and hope. I opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of black satin, was my grandfather's Patek Philippe. It was perfect. The crystal was clear, the gold casing polished to a soft gleam, the worn leather strap carefully restored. It was ticking. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I had a friend in the Napa Sheriff's Department, Cale admitted, his voice quiet. I asked him to go back and search the grounds the very next day. I had a feeling you'd want it back someday. He took the watch from the box and gently fastened it around my wrist. The cool, familiar weight settled against my skin. The scars on my back, a permanent roadmap of my family's betrayal, still ached on cold days. But this watch on my wrist was a different kind of reminder, a reminder of a different legacy. My grandfather's words, engraved on the back, felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Time will prove your worth, Zorla. Time had. A few months into the semester, during a guest lecture for a group of female cadets in their final year, one of them raised her hand. She was a bright, eager young woman who reminded me a little of myself at that age. "Professor Heath," she asked, "how do you deal with failure? With injustice? When people you're supposed to trust let you down?" The question hung in the air, raw and real. I paused, looking past her, out the tall, arched window toward the historic parade grounds, the plain, where generations of cadets had marched and trained. "West Point will teach you how to be a soldier," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet lecture hall. "They will teach you tactics and strategy and how to lead under fire. But they don't teach you how to heal. And that's a skill you'll need just as much." I looked back at the young woman, at all the hopeful, determined faces looking up at me. Resilience isn't about never falling down. It isn't about being unbreakable. It's about knowing how to get back up again and again and again, even when the scars remain. It's about learning that you have to be your own rescuer. I let my final point settle. And most importantly, it's about understanding, in your very bones, that your value is not determined by your family, by your rank, or by anyone else's opinion. It is inherent. You define it. No one can take it from you unless you let them. The story ends not with a grand event, but with a simple, perfect moment. It's a crisp autumn morning. Kyle and I are walking along Flirtation Walk, the path that winds along the Hudson. The leaves on the trees are a riot of red and gold, and the air is clean and cool. I'm using a cane, a sleek, specially designed carbon fiber one. My gait isn't perfect. There's a slight, permanent limp, a physical reminder of my history. But every step is steady, every step is my own, full of purpose. I am no longer the victim of the Heath estate. I am no longer defined by their cruelty or their ambition. I am a survivor, a professor, a partner to a man who saw my worth when I couldn't. I am the master of my own life. My family left me with a legacy of betrayal. But from those bitter ashes, I built a new one. A legacy of resilience, of honor, of a quiet, hard-won peace. Standing here, watching the sun rise over the Hudson, with Cale's hand warm in mine and my grandfather's watch ticking steadily on my wrist, I know this is my true inheritance. And it is more valuable than all the wine in Napa Valley. That sunrise over the Hudson wasn't just the end of my story. It was a message for anyone who feels trapped in a story someone else wrote for them. Your legacy is not what was done to you. It's what you choose to build from the ashes. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear that they have the strength to find their own sunrise, please like and share it. And subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience and hope. Remember, you are never truly alone.